The diesel engine rumbled like distant thunder as Big Jim Callahan guided his 18-wheeler through the amber twilight of Interstate 80. After 23 years of hauling freight across America's highways, the rhythm of the road had become his heartbeat, the hum of tires on asphalt his lullaby. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something stirred in the depths of his weathered soul. Jim had always been a practical man, 6'4", broad-shouldered, with hands like leather gloves and a beard that had gone silver around the edges. He believed in what he could see, touch, and fix with a wrench. God was something other folks talked about on Sundays, not something that concerned a man whose church was the open highway and whose congregation consisted of CB radio voices crackling through the static. The load he was carrying, medical supplies bound for Denver, was routine enough. But as the Nebraska plains stretched endlessly before him, Jim felt an unusual heaviness settling over his chest. It had been building for weeks now, this strange melancholy that seemed to seep into his bones during the quiet hours between truck stops. His daughter Sarah hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. Not since the divorce from her mother, not since he'd chosen the road over family dinners and soccer games. His ex-wife Linda had remarried a banker who wore suits and came home every evening at 6:30 sharp. Sarah called him Dad now. The banker. Not Jim. The CB radio crackled to life. Breaker 19, this is Moondog eastbound at mile marker 126. Got yourself a bear in the bushes up ahead, Big Jim. Better back it down. Jim keyed the mic. Thanks for the heads up, Moondog. This is Big Jim, westbound and down. But his heart wasn't in the trucker banter tonight. Even the familiar ritual of CB chatter felt hollow. As darkness fell, Jim pulled into a rest stop outside Grand Island. The parking area was nearly empty except for a couple of other big rigs and a battered minivan with Ohio plates. He killed the engine and climbed down from the cab, his joints protesting after 8 hours behind the wheel. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. Inside the truck stop diner, fluorescent lights buzzed over red vinyl booths and a coffee-stained counter. Jim ordered his usual, black coffee and a burger, medium rare. The waitress, a tired-looking woman named Dolores according to her name tag, moved with the weary efficiency of someone who'd been on her feet too long. "Long haul?" she asked, refilling his coffee cup. "Denver," Jim replied. "Then back to Chicago if I can find a return load." She nodded knowingly. "My late husband was a driver. 20 years on the road before his heart gave out. Said the highway was in his blood." Jim studied her face, seeing something familiar in her eyes, the particular loneliness that came from loving someone who was always leaving. "I'm sorry for your loss." "He died doing what he loved," she said with a sad smile. "Can't ask for much more than that, I suppose." After she walked away, Jim sat staring out the window at his truck, its chrome bumper gleaming under the parking lot lights. "Can't ask for much more than that." The words echoed in his mind. Was this really what he loved? Or had it become a prison of his own making, a way to avoid the messy complications of staying in one place, of facing his failures as a husband and father? Back in his sleeper berth, Jim lay listening to the distant hum of interstate traffic. The narrow bunk felt more confining than usual, the walls pressing in around him. He closed his eyes and tried to quiet his racing thoughts, but sleep remained elusive. Then, somewhere in the gray space between waking and sleeping, it happened. He was no longer in his truck. Instead, he stood on a vast plain that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, bathed in a light that was somehow both gentle and brilliant. The ground beneath his feet was solid, but he couldn't tell if it was earth or cloud or something else entirely. And there, walking toward him across this impossible landscape, was a man in simple robes. Jim knew immediately, with a certainty that bypassed all logic, who this was. The face was kind but weathered, like someone who had known both great joy and profound sorrow. The eyes held depths that seemed to contain all the wisdom of ages. "Jim," the man said, and his voice carried the warmth of a summer morning and the authority of rolling thunder. "Jesus." The name fell from Jim's lips before he could stop it. He felt foolish saying it. Big Jim Callahan, who hadn't set foot in a church since his wedding day, talking to Jesus like they were old friends. "You've been carrying a heavy load," Jesus said, settling down on what appeared to be a boulder that materialized from nowhere. "Come, sit with me." Jim found himself sitting across from the Son of God, feeling simultaneously terrified and completely at peace. "I don't understand what's happening." "Understanding isn't always necessary," Jesus replied. "Sometimes we just need to listen." "I've made a mess of everything," Jim heard himself confess. "My marriage, my relationship with my daughter. I chose the road over the people who mattered most." Jesus nodded slowly. "The road has been your escape, hasn't it? From responsibility, from pain, from the fear of not being enough." The words hit Jim like a physical blow. He wanted to deny them, to defend himself, but in this place of impossible light, pretense seemed pointless. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared I'd let them down, the way my old man let us down. So I kept moving, kept running. And now I'm alone. Sarah's grown up without me. She's in college, studying to be a doctor, and I don't even know what her favorite color is anymore." Tears he'd been holding back for years began to fall. "She's sick, you know. Leukemia. Linda called me last month. I wanted to go to her, but what right do I have? What good would I do?" Jesus reached out and placed a hand on Jim's shoulder. The touch was electric, sending warmth through his entire being. "Love always has rights, Jim. Always. The question isn't whether you deserve to be there. The question is whether you're brave enough to try." "But what if she doesn't want to see me? What if I just make things worse? What if you don't, and she dies knowing her father didn't even try?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Jim looked up into those ancient, compassionate eyes. "What should I do?" Jesus smiled then, and it was like watching the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains. "You know what to do, Jim. You've always known. The road has taught you about journeys, about carrying precious cargo from one place to another. Sometimes the most precious cargo is love. Sometimes the most important destination is home. But I don't know how to be a father anymore. I don't know how to be anything other than a driver. Being a father isn't about knowing everything. It's about showing up. It's about saying, 'I'm here, and I love you, and I'm not going anywhere this time.'" The light around them began to intensify, and Jim felt himself being pulled back toward waking. "Wait," he called out. "Will she be okay? Will Sarah be okay?" Jesus' voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the space around Jim with its warmth. "Have faith, Jim. Take her some flowers. Sunflowers. She still loves sunflowers." Jim jolted awake in his sleeper berth, his heart pounding. The digital clock on his dashboard read 3:17 a.m. He sat up, running his hands through his hair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A dream? A vision? He'd never been one for supernatural explanations, but the memory of that encounter felt more real than the vinyl seat beneath him. Sunflowers. How could he have dreamed about sunflowers? He'd forgotten entirely about Sarah's childhood obsession with them, how she'd insisted on planting them in every yard they'd ever lived in, how she'd decorated her bedroom with sunflower everything until she was 12. Jim climbed down from his cab and stood in the parking lot, looking up at the star-filled sky. The night air felt different somehow, charged with possibility. He pulled out his cell phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before dialing a number he knew by heart but hadn't called in months. "Linda, it's Jim. I know it's late. I know. Listen, I want to come see Sarah. I want to be there." The conversation that followed was difficult, full of old hurts and careful boundaries. Linda was protective, suspicious of his motives after years of broken promises. But something in his voice must have convinced her, because she finally gave him the address of the hospital in Columbus where Sarah was receiving treatment. Jim called his dispatcher and arranged for another driver to take the Denver load. For the first time in his career, he was putting something ahead of the schedule, ahead of the contract, ahead of the road. He pointed his truck east toward Ohio, driving through the night with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He stopped at a flower shop in Des Moines as soon as it opened, asking the surprised florist for the biggest, brightest sunflowers she had. The woman, perhaps sensing something in his urgency, put together an arrangement that looked like captured sunshine. The hospital room was sterile and white, filled with the quiet hum of medical equipment. Sarah lay sleeping in the narrow bed, her once thick auburn hair now wispy from chemotherapy. She looked so small, so fragile, Nothing like the vibrant 10-year-old who used to climb into his truck cab and pretend to drive while he did his pre-trip inspection. Linda sat in a chair beside the bed, looking up in surprise as Jim entered with his enormous bouquet of sunflowers. "You came," she said simply. "I came," he confirmed, suddenly feeling awkward and out of place in his flannel shirt and trucker cap. "How is she?" "The doctors say the treatments are working, but it's been hard. She's been so tired, so sick." Linda's voice trailed off. Jim approached the bed slowly, setting the flowers on the nightstand. As if sensing his presence, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she looked confused, then recognition dawned in her features. "Dad." The word hit him like a freight train. "Hey, sweetheart. I brought you some flowers." Sarah's gaze shifted to the sunflowers, and for the first time in months, she smiled, really smiled. "Sunflowers. You remembered." "Of course I remembered." Jim pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "Sarah, I'm sorry. For everything. For not being here, for choosing the road over you and your mom. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that I love you. I've always loved you." Tears began to roll down Sarah's cheeks. "I thought you forgot about me. I thought you didn't care." "Never," Jim said fiercely. "Not for a single day. I was scared, and I was stupid, and I let my fear keep me away. But I'm here now, and if you'll let me, I'm not going anywhere." Over the next several weeks, Jim rarely left Sarah's side. He took extended leave from his trucking company, sleeping in hospital waiting rooms and cheap motels near the medical center. He was there for every treatment, every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night when the medications made her sick. They talked about everything: her childhood memories, her dreams of becoming a doctor, his years on the road. Jim shared stories from his travels, painting pictures of sunrises over the Rockies and the endless beauty of America's highways. Sarah told him about school, about her boyfriend David, about the children's book she was writing about a little girl who plants sunflowers wherever she goes. Linda, initially wary, began to soften as she watched Jim transform from an absent father into a constant, steady presence. She saw how Sarah lit up when he walked into the room, how his silly jokes and gentle teasing brought color back to their daughter's pale cheeks. The miracle didn't come all at once. It came in small victories: a day without nausea, blood counts that improved instead of declined, Sarah sitting up and asking for real food instead of the liquid nutrition she'd been surviving on. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, then openly amazed as Sarah responded to treatment better than anyone had dared hope. 3 months after Jim's dream encounter with Jesus, Sarah was declared to be in complete remission. The cancer that had threatened to steal her young life had retreated, leaving behind only the faintest traces in her blood work. The oncologists called it remarkable, extraordinary, the kind of response they saw perhaps once in 100 cases. Jim knew better. He knew it was grace, pure and simple. A gift from the man he'd met on that impossible plane of light, the God who had reached down to touch a broken trucker's heart and show him the way home. On the day Sarah was discharged from the hospital, she insisted on stopping at a garden center on the way to Linda's house. She picked out dozens of sunflower seeds, explaining to Jim that she wanted to plant them in the yard, partly to celebrate her recovery, but mostly because she'd missed 3 planting seasons and had a lot of catching up to do. As they knelt together in the black earth, pressing seeds into the soil, Sarah looked up at her father. "Dad, I want to ask you something." "Anything, sweetheart." "Will you walk me down the aisle when I marry David?" Jim's hands stilled in the dirt. Are you getting married?" Sarah laughed, the sound like silver bells in the spring air. "Not yet. But someday. And when that day comes, I want my dad there. My real dad." Jim wiped his muddy hands on his jeans and pulled his daughter into a fierce hug. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." That evening, as they sat on Linda's back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jim felt a peace he'd never known in all his years on the road. The highway still called to him sometimes, the romance of the open road, the freedom of endless miles, but it was a quieter call now, one that could wait. He'd found something better than the perfect run or the ideal load. He'd found his way back to the people who mattered most, guided by a dream that had shown him the most important delivery of his life wasn't measured in miles or dollars, but in love freely given and received. 6 months later, the sunflower Sarah had planted stood tall and bright in Linda's backyard, their faces turned toward the sun like golden prayers of thanksgiving. Jim had bought a small house just a few miles away and found work with a local trucking company that had him home every night. He still drove truck, it was in his blood, after all, but now the road was just a job, not an escape. His real life was in the laughter he shared with Sarah over Sunday dinners, in the gradual rebuilding of trust with Linda, in the simple miracle of being present for the people he loved. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn as he prepared for another day of local deliveries, Jim would remember that night on the Nebraska plains and the dream that had changed everything. He would whisper a prayer of gratitude to the carpenter from Nazareth who had reached across time and space to touch the heart of a lost trucker and show him the way home. The miracle hadn't just been Sarah's healing, remarkable as that was. The real miracle had been the healing of a family, the restoration of love that had seemed lost forever, and the transformation of a man who had been running from himself for most of his adult life. Big Jim Callahan was still a trucker, but now he was something more, a father, a friend, and a living testament to the power of second chances. And every time he saw a field of sunflowers swaying in the breeze beside some distant highway, he smiled and remembered the night Jesus had visited him in his dreams and shown him that sometimes the longest journey is the one that brings you home.